Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swift Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is following politics or podcasting a waste of time? Tim.
By following politics, I mean reading and listening to a variety of different persons, both living and dead. I include economics, which is more Swifton's specialty, as the focus of libertarian as a form of politics. Whether it is or isn't by said libertarians is a good question, but this is where Wittgenstein comes in, and everyone else is for the win because everyone else views economics as a form of a subset of politics. So therefore, economic discussions are also a form of politics. If you take Moldbug, interestingly, if you take Moldbug, Chomsky, and Paul Gottfried, on one area which they all agree, and I think this is a related area, is that sports fanship oftentimes mirror political fanship. Now, this is both a criticism and praise. In a sense, Keith Preston will make fun of it. The elections are just no different than the Super Bowl or some World Cup game. You have two sides rooting against each other, in a sense. It's a sort of orchestrated event. What they disagree about is whether this is a good thing. Chomsky had an old interview where he's actually complaining that, he sometimes listens to AM radio and they had a sports call-in show. And these guys knew all the plays, knew the coaches, knew what might have been a better play in a situation. And Chomsky was saying this is such a waste. And that's sort of partly what I want to get into here, the sort of idea of a waste. Paul Gottfried, in a sense, agrees. He had on the Cato Gottfried, they had a thing. He said that he sort of dislikes college and football fanship in the United States because he thinks, and by football I mean the game with 100 yards. He thinks it's sort of a waste of power. I think that's actually a good phrase to use it as. It just sort of, it puts them into a kind of reservation, shall we say. In a sense, Chomsky and Gottfried are right, and for that matter, Moldbug are right in a sense, insofar as, I don't really affect the outcome if I root for a sports team. I vaguely have a relationship with him so far if I root for a given club that I can, by buying cable or maybe buying merchandise or buying tickets, but it's very small. It's an extremely small amount of money I'll contribute. Now maybe for the owners they contribute a lot, and actually that's more of if you look at sports economics, that's actually how they get this. That's how they get a lot of their money. In stadium economics, using taxpayer dollars to build stadiums, that's another way in which how they get their amass their fortunes, or IP, of course. So there's this political aspect of the wealth of athletes here. Now the players themselves, take someone like a Max Scherzer or a Clayton Kershaw. They should focus very much on the sport they're playing. They're baseball players. Of course they should, but they are the best players currently. So for them, they can focus on that. But the fans, not so much. Now the question is now this goes into voting. One of the arguments for the sort of standard social democratic civil Republican line is that you should educate yourself so you can vote better. Now I think this is sort of lame. For one thing, the parties are kind of the same in some sense on some key issues. And the Tom Woods law is whoever you vote for, you get John McCain. And there's a certain sense that's true. So this goes back to is following politics or podcasting a waste of time. So I started this podcast with you. I was on Todd Lewis a few times, and then I eventually just started this with you because I sort of wanted to move out of the out, just from outside looking in to the inside looking out. Now we have a fairly small show, but again, we have other commitments. We do other things. We do have other things to do, and in a sense, I would say I'm moving up the food chain from passive viewer to more power, so to speak. Again, we don't have that much power, but we can influence some people we know who listen to the show. We can lay out our arguments and so forth, which I'll get into a final point, which is why another benefit here. Before I started following politics, I used to be a very big baseball fan. I watched a lot of the games. I watched almost when I was in high school and college. I watched one year. I watched all the games. I knew many of the players. I played some fantasy baseball. In a sense, I look back at myself. Was I happier doing that than reading all these other things? I don't know. That's a good question. When Chomsky and Paul Gottfried complain about, their people being overly obsessed with sports, it could be in sort of a Plato's allegory, a cave analogy, that the sports fans in the cave are happy. They're just sort of not very aware of it. Now, you could say, well, we can have a reasonable amount of time, but this is the case where the hardcore sports fans don't the hardcore sports fans don't really, so to speak. The light fan is sort of a mistake. You have the hardcore fans, and you have a lot of light fans who just occasionally watch games. The hardcore fans, that's the same way with politics here. At this point, we're sort of like, not to use a pejorative phrase, we follow the game of politics and society and culture pretty closely, at least to the degree, at least with some of the older dead thinkers as well. So now Hans Hoppe was asked this question, why did he start the PFS, and does he think that what he's doing is a waste of time? Well, as everyone knows, Hans Hoppe started as a Frankfurt-schooled Marxist. Many of his enemies and his friends would point that out. And his things, well, he likes watching. Well, he says, "I just follow the truth." That's a terrible Hoppe impersonation, but he just follows the truth here. I largely agree with that claim here. So do the left-wing people. They'll just say, well, that's just the position I hold. I don't hold it for any other reason. He says he gets the kind of enjoyment out of watching failed policies get enacted and then fail. What he views as failed policies. He created the PFS to create a counter elite here. There's probably a kind of Christian message there, in there. That's why I follow politics in a sense. I want to understand the world, not necessarily change the world. That's a paraphrased Marxist quote. If I happen to change the world, great. If I don't, great. There might be some kind of deep cynicism in there. I do, in a sense, agree the likelihood of changing the world. We did an episode on Nick Land, Mark Fisher, and McIntyre is fairly low, and in a sense there. And I do think conservatives haven't really been able to conserve anything. I don't think the Libertarian Party's a very effective institution here. So if you ask me, what's the alternative, what I'm doing? Well, before I was doing sports, and I do, in a sense, think sports on some level is probably a waste of time. Now, what's not waste of time, I think, and one of the things I do enjoy about doing this podcast is our sort of more broadly societal episodes, like why do people have children, or what's the purpose of sex, or or some of our theological, more Christian related things. I don't think that's a waste of time. I think if you take Protestantism seriously, that sort of has to happen. You have to have sort of private civil society organizations. Even Catholicism, I think I would agree, dispersing or arguing about what Christianity is and isn't in a certain society on given issues. I think that's very relevant. I think that's a very good use of time. So maybe not arguing over the Trump election or some things like that is a waste of time. I do think it's better than arguing just generically online on using comment sections. So I do think starting a podcast is an improvement over that, even if you don't get that many views. And finally, I think my final point here is I think one thing that we should be rooting for is take someone like R.C. Sproul. Apparently, R.C. Sproul had a big influence. His favorite influence was John Gerstner. John Gerstner's influence was some of this random country preacher guy from Pennsylvania. Who knew? So, you think about the long-term influence. This is the Hayek point. That actually Keynes made the point, but that you have these random scribes looking at dead scribes from 200 years ago. That's also an influence we should have. If an Ancapistan society ever does happen, maybe they'll go back and read one of our episode pages just about our descriptions. Who knows? Maybe not. I know I said final point, but one other point is we get improvement in skills. We speak better. Now, again, some people might think I speak quite poorly. I thought I spoke worse before I did this show. It improves your confidence. I don't think there's anything wrong with, in a sense, we're getting up and talking in front of, in some cases 10, in some cases 1,000 people. One of our videos is posting that, approaching that. So I do think we get those kind of benefits. I do have to write a few paragraphs. That's a useful skill. If you're not publishing it, you don't really check your work in the same way if you're just writing it for your own private enjoyment. So those skills, in actually starting a podcast. Now, this isn't following politics. Although when following politics, you do have to read or listen carefully to complex, nuanced things generally, at least if you're doing it at a high level. You're not just watching CNN or Fox News. We had Terminal Philosophy on. He likes to make fun of that. I agree. In a sense, you should. Go a little deeper here. Maybe at least, go to First Things or go to like Jacobin. Again, you can criticize those publications all you want, but those are some skills of following politics. I do think it's in some sense a step up from sports fanship. So like, what would I do in place of this? I don't know. I mean, the previous thing I did with my time, it can't be some, the economist has this substitution of goods theory, which I think is a sort of good idea. It can't be something that is totally disanalogous to what it is. It can't be, more work. That's one of the default things people will do if they don't follow politics, is they'll just spend more time working and producing consumer goods. Or so there is like, what's the alternative if you're not like reading, political articles or theological articles or starting a podcast? What would you do with those 5 hours a week? I don't know. You could say, well, you could walk more. But then again, this goes back into like, it has to be a good replacement. It can't just be a replacement that's totally like something different. So Swithin, I've sort of went through why I follow politics and why I wanted to start this show. It is an outlet in a sense from me, but I haven't proved my other skills here. Why do you follow politics? Do you think it's better than sports? And why did you go along with starting this podcast? Or I forget who exactly asked. Swithin?
I think one of the reasons I started it was because, well, as you mentioned before, it started in lockdown and wasn't really very much else to do. I also thought it was a good idea because it gives me motivation to actually read up on topics which I always thought that I probably should have done, but haven't. Because if you're preparing it for a show, then it actually forces you to do things. So it kind of gives you deadlines for things that don't really need deadlines, but forces you to do them because otherwise you would never really get round to doing it. Another reason, I mean, it gives me an outlet to discuss a broad range of topics, which I can actually have some reasonably interesting input from you on, and guests as well, for that matter. You mentioned comment sections. I came across a comment section, like a Facebook page, was it today? And I was so tempted to go to respond to guy, can you actually read? The guy commented on this article that how basically that there was the selective teaching of the evils of like the British Empire and sort of American slavery and stuff. Because the Arabs had them, basically everyone else had slaves. And this guy says, "Oh, you're opposing talking about the bad bits of British history." It's like, you can't read, or you choose not to read. So I think very much staying away from comment sections is probably a very good idea. You could just waste so much time doing it. But a broader question is, though, I suppose, is why am I interested in the topics that we do? So, for instance, one of my favorite episodes was the Is Aristotle Right About Slavery episode, because slavery is often discussed, and oh no, slavery is obviously just obviously bad. It's like, well, hang on, is it really? Is there a case that you can make for it? So I think. I suppose this would be the way I would frame it. I think the intellect in humans is directed towards the truth, and different people just have, depending on their sort of IQ to a crude measure, have kind of a level of complexity of topic that they kind of go to. and then some people are just interested in different areas. So science is okay. I find it reasonably interesting, but I've always found, for instance, like economics and politics far more interesting than science, which is, I'm glad that people do like science and like engineering, because bridges are kind of quite useful. But I don't find them particularly intellectually interesting. So I think there's just the nature of the intellect, that it's focused on the truth of something. The question is, what is that thing? And I think that just depends on the individual. It depends on the individual, what they find interesting. I suppose I like politics and economics. It's like a system. I like things to be consistent and to be built up from like consistent premises, which is why I think I was attracted to Austrian economics to some extent, and what you could consider basically non-empiricist, or in the sort of 18th century onwards, sort of philosophical stuff. It's like empiricism is stupid. Like this is just ad hoc rationalization stuff. There's no real sort of genuine thought. No, but obviously this is an overgeneralization, etc. But you'd see the point. Now, when it comes to sort of like party politics, do I follow that? I kind of follow it a little bit, but I don't follow it nearly as close as I used to, because there's nothing you can do about it. And I suppose this is one of the reasons why being, as it were, broadly speaking, politically aware is bad, because, well, you see, hang on, that's a really, really bad idea. Why are they doing it? I think this is where you just have to get to a position of going, well, I can't actually, at the moment, particularly influence it. I may as well just focus on what I can do now to, I don't know, was Joel Osteen's book, Your Best Life Now, or something? Focusing far too much on something outside of your control is not a particularly good thing, which is why I think some sports fans get really insane, especially when they're all engrossed by how bad their team is and how terribly managed they are. It's like, you can't really do anything about this. Why are you allowing something that's so far out of your control to affect the way you behave? And it's not even as if the government was locking you in your house and arresting you if you left. It was like a case, your sports team is doing badly. So there are problems of following and being aware in this way, but I think it then just, I think after time you have to generate some sort of sense of remoteness and detachment from the political process and go, well, actually, can't do anything about that. I may as well write about how it should do, and then hopefully some people who do actually have some influence may listen eventually or change. And I suppose if you're someone who might be good at sort of political activism, although I'm generally dubious of the certainly for the non-left at present, the political activism is actually has much benefit outside possibly certain narrow ranges of things. So that would be, I'd say, the reason I think politics, I as it were, follow politics. I think human interaction and the structure, which would be the best possible or the least bad, whatever you want to describe it, social arrangement would be, I find inherently interesting. I suppose as well, from my perspective, with politics in general, I want to explain why not telling me what I should do all the time is a good idea. Because increasingly in the UK, as in America, the space for sort of individual decision making and responsibility is becoming ever and ever narrower. So I suppose that is at least helpful, even if ultimately it's a tragic failure. That you can at least explain why, for instance, so the Department of Education shouldn't be determining everything I do with my children, or how the Department for Health shouldn't be prescribing what diet I feed my children, etc. So those would be some broad brushstrokes on the reasons I would follow politics.
So I'll combine the next two questions. I think they're similar, and I'll sort of answer quick. I've sort of outlined my answer somewhat. what are the costs of being politically aware? What are the benefits? And would you be happier if you didn't follow quote unquote politics? Again, I'm sort of inferring this broadly here. To go back to the COVID policies, there's certain to a certain extent, if I didn't know about it, if I just believed what everything that CNN said, would I be happier? Well, for one thing, if I lived in a big city, I think I would have to some extent, believe it, or else be a really good cynic, an extremely good cynic, just to sort of mask up. There's an old Tom Woods show on H.L. Mencken, what H.L. Mencken did in World War One, and I think I forget the guy. It's a PFS guy. And he was, he basically had to sort of butter up and just shut up about this topic here, and he couldn't write anything. So there are certain topics where, if there is a mass, if there's a lot of public propaganda going toward a goal or something, I mean, you can laugh at it, you can make jokes about it, if of course that's illegal to do. But there's sort of, on certain policies, there's a sort of limit of what you can actually do. You could go full Julian Assange and start WikiLeaks, but if you don't want to end up in a Belmarsh prison, although I think what Julian Assange did was honorable here. So there's certain topics where if you become aware of something and you think it's stupid, and you think or even worse, it's evil, not just mere stupidity, there might be limited things to do. And if you do know about it and you can't do those things, or you don't think those things are worthy to do in your situation, let's say you have kids, or let's say you want to do something else with your life, to go, a lot of people say, well, wearing a mask is a very small thing. And I'm like, okay, and I was on an airplane, I wore it. So, but in other circumstances, I didn't wear it. I didn't wear it very properly, and I wasn't really afraid of it. So that's I guess is a use. Although I do get some pushback from certain authorities and things like that I wasn't properly wearing it. So, and I have gotten into sort of fights online, of course, over the efficacies of taking vaccines and boosters. So this goes back to the Hoppe line. You see a failed policy and you see it fail, you get a kind of enjoyment out of it. Although during it, you're sort of a political outcast in a sense, especially in certain circles. So those are some real costs here, to being politically aware. This goes back to the cave analogy. One of the things I have always thought is, were the people in the cave happy? And it's like, well, it seems like the mass people are happy. There's plenty of people clearly don't follow the news at all, or anything, which this seems interesting here, the people that don't do it. Now, that might be less true now than it was. Maybe the Amish, although supposedly Amish, when they go to the grocery stores, they'll just spend all time watching Fox News. So it could be that they aren't really this sort of out as much of an out group as they think they are, and they probably illicitly use phones too. There are reports of that. There's a documentary about it. I thought that I got a kick out of that. So, Swithin, would you be happier if you didn't do this? I think that's a sort of misuse of the word happy, if I said that. Although maybe not, because I think there's a certain higher. To go back to the ancient Greeks, I think there's a higher, or Aquinas here, there's a higher good in knowing something to be true, even though in the short term it might bring you grief, so to speak, from the authorities or the surrounding society here. Look, take Julian Assange here. Julian Assange released the documents that detailed the Iraq war logs and things like that. He brought about things. Now, we don't do that necessarily. We've interviewed a guy on him. We've publicly defended him. Not publicly, but publicly in the sense on the web. So I think that's useful here. But would you be happier? And what would you be doing otherwise? Well, that's the fourth question. Forget that one. Just what are the costs of being politically aware? What are the benefits? Would you be happy if you were, so to speak? I forget the pill, blue pilled yeah. Would you be happier if you didn't know anything, if that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think unless I could find another outlet that I found as interesting on like a systematic basis. Maybe I could just devote my time to, I don't know, epistemology or metaphysics or something, maybe. But or aesthetics, possible. I potentially could see me going aesthetic. But the thing is that even going on like the metaphysical and the aesthetics and stuff, you're going to end up hitting sort of ethics at some point of some description, and then that is just getting you back into the same game again. How should you live? How should you live, and how you should live, and having the best, like a virtuous or flourishing life, when you want to describe it, is going to depend on the sort of social conditions in which you're raised, and that depends what other people do. And you're asking the same question. So I don't know. I think in a sense I'm doomed to investigate politics in a way. Now, would I be happy if I didn't? Well, possibly, in that I'd be going, okay. Well, insofar as I might just take my time away from the news and do something else, because the news is just horrendous. But actually, though, even though I am sort of relatively politically aware, I don't actually watch the news anymore. I did have the BBC's news app, but then I just got increasingly fed up of it during 2020, and I was like, I just got rid of it. And now the only thing I have is the Epoch Times, which I picked only because it was some relatively non-mainstream app which gave me broad world news. And I flick through that once a morning, and I see a couple of articles on Facebook here and there. But that's it. So in a way, I don't follow it, because especially if you're like my mother, follows politics and then just gets angry at the radio all the time. It's like there's no point. Just, you don't like them and think they're talking rubbish, just switch them off, and just do something else. So I certainly do think there are people who focus far too much, especially on party politics. That's ridiculous. Unless you're some sort of community organizer.
I'm a quick interrupt here, if you don't mind. Swithin here, I think this is where an instance where sports fan is actually superior to political fanship, because occasionally the team wins, and occasionally good policy, and occasionally they score a goal, they hit a field, occasionally they win, and they get a lot of utiles of enjoyment out of it. With politics, especially once you get into more extreme fringes, you're always losing. By definition.
Although you could say that the to what extent is a victory is another question. But you could say, Roe v. Wade has been overturned, and so that gives some of the at least the pro-lifers some sort of hope for the first time in 50 years. Now, of course, it could be re-overturned and whatever. But I think people do it because that's why 2016 was good. That's why on the more radical ends, in certain respects, everyone liked 2016 because Brexit happened and the establishment in America got stuffed a little bit. But then everything went back to normal thereafter. So in recent years, you could argue there have been some mild victories. But I would agree, at least if you've got a terrible side, you will score a goal at least once a season. So that's more than you get as a Republican or like a Conservative Party sort of fan, as it were.
Or for that matter, as a Marxist or anarchist. I mean, the same thing applies. I mean, the Democrats here in the United States, if you're a Marxist, and this is sense I've internalized certain messages here. Like, they're not a Marxist party. They're not going to organize the labor into a revolution. We've done an episode on that. But yeah, so yes. That time I think they're both the sports fanship. Moldbug calls it like honest political masturbation is sports fanship, in the sense that you don't. It's not, you use the word there or we. You say don't use the word we, but also don't use the term we when you're talking about like the government as well. I think that's a useful insight here. But keep going. Sorry for interruption.
That's fine. So yeah, I do think some people would be better off. No, although one of the advantages of knowing it, I mean, interesting politics is I think you do find you do go into topics that you otherwise may not have thought were worthwhile, and then can impact your own life. So, for instance, I can't remember how I got into. Oh no, how I got into education was that I needed to get a job, so I did in teaching, because it was a way I could get a decent-ish job after I was married. But insofar as I thought it was, I suppose insofar as being a teacher, but I could see how someone might be interested in the politics and go, oh, I'll get education, and then, oh, look how bad education is, as sort of like a political, sort of more general party political standpoint. But then that could be a jumping off point for going, well, okay, what would a good education look like? How could you best do that? And then you might not then just follow the same paths as everybody else does, and then you and your children may be better off as a result of it. On the flip side, of course, being politically aware might mean that you're somewhat less easy to, well, you might be less pliable to the corporate hierarchy, and therefore not climb up as easily. Now, no, that's not a one-to-one correlation with politics and stuff. But I don't know, maybe the firm's involved in some sort of lobbying of some description, like, well, no, this is a bad idea, even if it's good for the company. It's like, well, we don't like you because we're going to do stuff that's good for the company. So I think there can be individual benefits, but I say there do tend to be a lot of costs. I think with politics, you just need to get what you can out of it without it turning you into a complete misanthrope. Is I say, to develop some sort of stoic detachment from it and treat it as absurd and laugh at it, of the current state of things. I think that's the only real way you can go. Otherwise, you turn into Peter Hitchens, who seems to be permanently glum.
Interesting. So what would you do? I mean, Peter Hitchens views himself as writing the obituary for Britain. What would you do if you weren't doing this with your time? And I'm talking about the literal, like, the hour or two, or in some sense, the literal hour or two we're doing to record the show and the pre-episode discussion. Economists have this idea, which I think is one of the more useful economist ideas, the substitution of goods theory. So, like, cutting the grass, or trimming hedges, or I don't know, that's not really a substitution. I mean, it needs to be something intellectual here. That's why sports fanship at a high level, I that's sort of replaced in a sense with it. And actually, sports led to politics, and oftentimes politics lead to sports, in a sense, because some of the better analysis of sports end up being quote unquote vaguely political, insofar as if you want to analyze what teams are better than other teams, you have to start looking into, well, what are better managers, what are better methods of selecting players, drafting players, free agents, and then like Nate Silver, for example, got his start, who's 538 guy, got his start in baseball, for example. That's actually the first time I've heard of his name. And then Nate Silver had a debate, not a debate with a capital D, but sort of various Twitter disputes with Nassim Taleb. That's one of the ways in which I found Nassim Taleb here, because, and in a sense, that's one of the ways in which there's a lot of pipes between the two here, and some of them are more unfortunate here. Like, Alex Berenson was complaining that, like, SportsCenter has, like, like the hosts themselves were telling people to get vaccinated. That's kind of annoying, and I agree that is annoying. And the flag thing is a kind of annoying thing as well. In some sense, I'm more like, in some sense, at times I approach Walter Block territory, where Walter Block does not stand for the national anthem sometimes. So this is horseshoe theory in action here. Although I don't actually, it's a nice song, shall we say? So the substitution of goods here, you can't, I guess I could focus more on theological debates and things like that. That's sort of similar domain there. But I don't find them as interesting as, maybe as interesting as I put on. But I'm sort of interested. Politics is interesting because it's sort of like, what do we do here on Earth question here, and and it's sort of related to culture too, and history. And those are the more interesting topics to me. If someone gave me 20 books, I would probably choose, warfare history would be something like that. Would be one of the first ones I choose. And politics, in some extent, the Clausewitz doctrine situation of war by other means here. And I do think war and violence is a sort of backdrop here that sort of forms there. And I am a political science major here. I sort of chose that thing by default here. I didn't really like the other degrees. I think, well, this is as good as any other degree here in a sense, which is kind of a jaded yet true point here. Unless you're getting an engineering degree, to a certain extent, where a lot of degrees are, they're all basically the same in terms of like job placement and things like that. They're just say you have the sheepskin or you don't. So I picked political science. Now, most political science professors don't have that much power, and they're actually quite boring in a way. I mean, you have the John Mersheimers and other ones that are more interesting, but you just work for a think tank, and it's like, well, you just sort of make better versions of American public propaganda, or you work for some bureaucracy here. So maybe that's a cost, being politically aware. But then this goes back to sort of the idea of the quote unquote truth or honor, in a sense. If you have a statement, and if an institution is working against that, you shouldn't really work for that. Now there are certain problems within it. Should you take these benefits or should you work for related things? But I would say if you don't have to, you shouldn't, and especially if you don't find it interesting. And sometimes I don't find education as interesting because many students don't really care and are correct not to care. This is where I disagree in some sense with Chomsky in a way, and Moldbug and Gottfried, in the sense that people who are politically unaware, I'm more like, well, that's great that you don't know that masks are stupid. In a weird sense it is, because like now you just put it on and you just go about, it might be annoying. Or even take a war, for example. If there was a draft here in the United States, when Hillary, one of the reasons why I went out and voted for Trump and not just stayed home, is I thought, well, there's a chance that Hillary Clinton starts a war with Russia and I could get drafted. I was still of draft age, class 1, in the United States. And I was thinking, well, but if you look at people who actually go to military service, it's not, again, this is an interesting thing where the conscientious injectors end up looking more unhappy in a weird way than the people who just go along, go to Vietnam or go to Germany or go to Japan. They get to experience whatever it is, and there's a certain sense where maybe that's a false dichotomy here. But back to the first question I asked here: what would you be doing if you weren't doing this? Now, would you be making more consumer goods? Would you be working more? And would that be a better usage of your time, if, of course, that's possible? Swithin?
I would probably, well, given the times that we use, I would probably read more than I currently do. Although, given the fact that we record typically in the evenings, at least for me, I find that quite difficult, especially if I've been working on a computer all day, because that's basically what I do. So I might read more. Now, the stuff I would read would generally be political in various ways, or related to that. Although, just to note, I am a sports fan. Maybe I'm not as engaged as I was. So predominantly soccer, or football for the English listeners. And depending on how you go about it, there was a very interesting sports book, which was basically the history of football tactics, soccer tactics, from like the mid 19th century to the present day. Now, why does that have value apart from just football? Well, because really, sports to a large extent are very similar to warfare. And the more you look, and this is also true of games, if you ever play things, well, actually, no, it's true of like a lot of RPG or shooter games. It's also true of board games. If you have a piece on a board, like you have a soldier in battle, the way you win is almost always about manipulation of space. You need to sort of move the space in such a way so you can get an advantage. And this is what sort of history of football formations and tactics were like. Well, how do you get your advantage over your opposition? And typically what it is just getting into the right place, manipulated such that you are in the position where you can do the most damage. And then a lot of the time is, how would you get to that position? And that's a lot of sort of battlefield tactics. So if you go that way with kind of sports is actually useful. It is very similar to a warfare. So I would probably do some reading. If anything, I suppose I could be boring and watch more TV series of various descriptions, although my view of most TV series is very low. So I might just get fed up and not watch it. So it would probably be some additional reading. There are some stuff I work on, right? Like I edit the annual video of the individual family videos. So it's bits of stuff like that. But I would probably could have turned out to do similar stuff. I just wouldn't talk to you. I think that would be specifically what I would be doing differently.
One of the troubles with modernity here is that if this kind of technology, let's say we just wind back the clock to 2000 and I was this age and you were this age, it might not be the case that we'd have this quote unquote relationship. But then again, people in real life wouldn't be also distracted by podcasts and other online venues, that they wouldn't be that they wouldn't do this. There's a book. This I guess is an example of the siloing of society, for better or for worse. Insofar as, actually, strangely enough, not to get too much, we might be vaguely related, vaguely, in like the 20th degree here. So there's a certain extent where we have similar interests in a lot of things here. So I do enjoy discussing here. And if we didn't have the internet, we suddenly go back, or didn't have a good internet, I probably would find this in quote unquote real life, this kind of engagement here. But this is where I think Slavoj Zizek and some of the technoists are correct, that in a sense, engaging people on the internet is no different than engaging people on letters. It's actually superior to engaging people in letters or in engaging people in televised debates. And this is just the opening up of society via internet in some sense here. So we are taking advantage of that, and we are using that. So I might have done this. I might have found, I might have been more engaged in college organizations or things like that I didn't have the internet to be a giant magnet here. And maybe actually the organizations would have been better. To some extent, the main event is the internet at this point. It's not like there's some environment here that's the online stuff in some weird sense is more important than the offline stuff in certain, political, theological, and social realms. It happens on the web. You can hate that. You can say that's a bad thing, but that's just the way it is at this point. I think that's broadly uncontroversial here. So you may as well get on. And the people that, old people use their phones and listen to podcasts too. Go to, they'll stare at, the idea that people over 60 don't use their phones is false. Go to watch old. They actually, I'd argue they actually in some sense might be worse off by, they watch like Fox, and some of them just watch Fox News or CNN if you're more of a liberal minded. So I do think getting more into it on a higher level is useful here. So, and if no one watched the show, actually, zero, I still think it would be useful here to do, because I do improve my speaking. I do read more interesting things. You forwarded me a number of articles which I would have never found or would have even looked for that I thought were quite interesting here. And this is another sense, I think, in this sense that we are taking advantage of the quote unquote event of progress here. In some sense, I'm very sympathetic to the reactionary line here, but one of the benefits of progress is you can find people in random parts of the world that have very similar views to you or complementary in a sense. And you can sort of dive off into topics here, although that might be a bug, of course. That might be a bug, of course, in some broader sense, and it probably is. But you may as well take advantage of the short-term and medium-term benefits here, insofar as, well, I'm not going to find someone who has the same interests as me in real life, or very, very low probability. Most people, to the extent they know anything about politics, it's quite lame, or it's even worse, I would view it as wrong here, and I sort of have to hold my tongue and not argue with them. Of course, I could lose. There are people I might be afraid of. That's another thing I find useful here. I won't name them publicly, but there are people that I said, well, if I was engaged in a public debate with here, and not merely on rhetoric points, because I might lose it on rhetoric points, I probably would, and it's charisma, I might lose. But what argument would I make if a socialist or Marxist came to me, or something like that, or what argument would I make? And that's what I think about here. If in an ideal world, what would I make to counter them? So I do find that useful here. So even if no one listened to it, I do think it's interesting talking to you, since you forward me a number of interesting things. So that's my overall comments of why I do it. And this is our 100th episode. So Swithin, do you have any comments, like, what do you get out of it, and or any comments on my comments? That's my final comment there. Thanks for doing this show in general too.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy it. I mean, I finding someone with sort of relatively similar political social views is relatively small. My family is somewhat similar in certain respects, but I live quite far away from them now. So yeah, finding somebody like that to talk to is somewhat difficult. I mean, I suppose, you could rally together a few people at a pub occasionally, but you need sufficient mass of population. I mean, in a major city, you could possibly do it. But outside of there, with a very, very large population, being able to get enough people who are sort of sufficiently interesting or interested in and have similar points that you do, you're not going to do it. So having this outlet and, just the internet in general for sort of video chat means that I can stay relatively sane around people, as opposed to going, hang on, I now need to tell you in great detail why you are wrong, because that probably wouldn't be particularly useful. It probably just make me annoyed, but I kind of feel like I had to do it because I had no sort of outlet. So yeah, even if a few people did listen, I probably would do this anyway. And on that note, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends and family. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and more people can access material. Which, of course, more people listening, the better. Everything else being equal. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrime@gmail.com. That's mindcrime@gmail.com.